Rob Welling, welcome back to Built to Sell Radio.
It is great to be here, John. Thank you for inviting me.
You are one of my favorite episodes of Built to Sell Radio, so I want everybody to go back and listen to it if they haven't done so. But you're also one of my mentors and North Stars when it comes to life after an exit. And that's really why I wanted to have you back, because when I look at all of the stuff you've got going on, the new book, the MicroConf, Tiny Seed, all the stuff, I just think this is a guy who's charged up, dialed in, and he probably doesn't need to work. So I want to get underneath that because we've got a lot of listeners who will go through an exit. They're going to, they're at the beginning stages of maybe a 6, 7, 8-figure exit, and they'll have to deal with some of these questions. So I'd love to sort of dig in with you. So thanks for doing this. Tell me a little bit about Drip. I know for folks who haven't listened to the episode, many have, but if they didn't listen to it, describe the business and the exit just, as in a succinct fashion if you can.
Sure. Yeah. So we launched Drip in 2013. I launched it with a co-founder. It's a SaaS app. Basically wound up being a competitor to like a MailChimp or an Infusionsoft. So an email service provider with marketing automation built in. We bootstrapped it up to about 10 employees, few million in revenue, and then sold it in an all-cash transaction to a company called Leadpages, which some of your audience may have heard of.
Sure.
And later, I like to joke that we kind of acquired Leadpages because what actually happened is they bought Drip, and then they realized, the Leadpages landing page market isn't huge. It's 100 million, 200 million, and then venture, they had raised a bunch of venture, right? So that's not that big of a market. The marketing automation, email service provider market, billions and billions and billions. And so they actually reorganized the whole company around Drip, and they later sold Leadpages as a product off. So in essence, now the team, all the VC, everything is actually behind Drip in a very odd turn of events. But I was able to exit for enough money that I didn't have to work again. And that obviously created an interesting paradox of choice, because then you have to, should I work? What should I work on? I can work on anything. So I don't want to do stuff I don't want to do something I don't want to enjoy, I don't enjoy, but also isn't anything worth doing, maybe a little hard and something you don't enjoy at times. So maybe we'll dig into some of that during this conversation. For sure.
What's it like for you to see Drip in the wild today?
It is surreal because, it's a product now with tens of thousands of users. And as I said, when we sold, we were a team of 10. And by the time I stuck around for a little under 2 years and worked there, ran product and engineering. And by the time I left, we were doing tens of millions in revenue and employees, 125 maybe. And I was managing at a team of 25 people. So it was just mind boggling to me that, how quickly it got there. And I still use it on a day-to-day basis. And I think, man, I love this product. I will admit, since I'm a product person, right? I build software. They've done some things that irritate me. And I'm like, why did they change this? This part of it, doesn't work the way I want it to. But it is really neat to hear. People will not know my name and they've never heard of MicroConf or Tiny Seed, but someone will say, oh, he's the founder of Drip. And they're like, oh, I love Drip. That's incredible. Like, that is weird to me that like the Drip brand in some circles is far beyond my own.
Do you ever think maybe I sold too early?
Not usually, but when someone asks me, I always think, did I sell too early? Because certainly it could have sold for more a year later or 2 years later, right? It was growing. I mean, at the time I sold, it doubled. It doubled that year. We were going to double again. So, and it was in the 7 figures of revenue already. So I'm not a big regrets person unless I make a bad choice or if I make an emotional choice that I didn't think through very well, then later I will say, I wished I'd chosen differently. But John, from the first email to the sale was 13 months. I had a lot of time to think about every aspect of the sale. And I had a bottom line number that I would not sell for below that. Because again, it was like, if I sell this, I need to have the flexibility to not have to go again. And we hit that number. I didn't have to stick around I stuck around longer than my earnout because I would, you know what I mean? It's like, so I don't have any regrets. Sometimes I do wonder, I could certainly have a little more money, It'd be nice to fly private sometimes, but I know. But it's like, could I have lasted another year? Because I was pretty burned out, man. I mean, I've been kind of public about this, but like, it was a rough go the last 12, 18 months, I wasn't managing my mental health very well. And I don't know, other things would have been impacted. Like maybe I could have sold for 2 or 3 times more and maybe I would be divorced. Like that's honestly a very real could have happened. So I try to think of it in that respect of like, it's all about trade-offs.
How is it impacting your marriage?
How was it? I was pressure cooker, stressed, burned out. In retrospect, so I never think, oh, I shouldn't have sold. What I actually think is I should have justified to myself to hire an operations person. I should have hired 1 fewer developers and taken a huge swath of a bunch of stuff I didn't like off of my plate, because I was trying to keep the developers moving forward. I was trying to keep sales and customer success and support. So I didn't bother anyone with anything and I did all the grunt work. And since we were bootstrapped, like we were cash strapped. It sounds, hey, great, 7 figures. We're doubling. We had like barely any money in the bank. And so I was stressed about making payroll. I was stressed about all this crap on my Trello board that I didn't want to do. And now that I have distance from it, when you're burned out, your sense of reality is actually distorted. And people would tell me, I have friends, I have a wife who's a psychologist. And
we've had her on the show.
Yeah. And she would say like, figure out how to do this and that. And I would say, oh, it's just not possible. I would say things that now that I look back and I'm like, what was I doing? My thinking was clouded with this kind of burnout / it wasn't technically depression. I'm not someone who naturally is depressed, but it was a grind that I could have handled better. And I think that if I have regrets, are things that those are the types of things I regret. You asked me how it impacted my marriage. It just made me crappy to be around. I was in a bad mood all the time. I was grumpy at night. My wife would say, hey, can you take the kids to this and that? And it's like, I don't have time. I got to work. I got to work another few hours to get this stuff done, right? I was not the enjoyable conversationalist that you know me to be. I was a grumpy ass person who was just kind of mad all the time. And that definitely doesn't make for a great marriage.
How did you figure out your number?
I worked backwards I looked at the 4% rule, and I don't think the 4% rule is enough. I'm guessing your audience knows that. I kind of started thinking more about the 3% rule, because I had heard some folks, say that even in the worst times, like 3% will get you. And that's where you can draw 3% of your cash balance each year and never run out of money. And so I said, I want a healthy income. So I'm going to multiply that number by 33.3. And I want that much cash at the end. So then you have to back out taxes. And, I had a co-founder who's a minority stake, but still you had to back that out and whatever, legal fees and other stuff. And then I put in, of course, a margin of error because I like to have that.
Nice. And when you thought about your lifestyle, were you kind of budgeting in big upgrades to your lifestyle? Or was it like, if I just want to live this life that I've built today, what do I need?
It wasn't huge upgrades. I'm actually, this may be something I would do a little differently. I was not budgeting in big upgrades. I was already making low 6 figures and figured, I would want to make that or more each year. So it's we were in California at the time, now we're in Minneapolis, but it was a healthy income. And, we have a nice house and nice cars. I didn't build in anything of like, I want to make $500,000. I don't want my I want my 3% to be $500,000 a year. Like that wasn't something that I had grown up with or thought about. Since then, I actually, what was interesting is in selling Drip and then taking the cash balance, I remember thinking, well, that's it. That's the nest egg. And I have it for the rest of my life. I did make some strategic bets and I got in on crypto in 2016. So made a good chunk of money there. And then some other stuff with collectibles and the stock market. And now I have quite a bit more than the exit amount. And I realized that while it doesn't make a difference in my day-to-day life, it did allow us to to get a really nice house by a lake that is quite a bit more expensive than say we lived in a $400,000 house in Fresno, for example, when we moved out, and the house we live in today is, several times that amount. And I didn't really think that would be an option or a desire, but it turns out at a certain point, I think it did actually improve our quality of life pretty substantially to have a larger house. We had several kids at the time. So
Sounds like I've never flown private, but it sounds like the kind of idea, like once you fly private, you're screwed. You'll never go back. Like you're taking one step up the lifestyle ladder, you'll never actually want to step off of again.
Yeah, a luxury once there's that phrase, a luxury once sampled becomes a necessity. I think it's a terrible. I think it's a stoic saying, but I'm always pretty careful with that stuff because it's like, oh my eyes, I can go on Zillow today and be like, oh my gosh, these houses are so much bigger than mine. Maybe we should aspire to do that. And it's like, no, let's tone it down.
Yeah. What was the time after you sold during the earnout? What was that time like? Just qualitatively, what words would you use to describe it?
So the acquirer, they were great and they honored all the verbal stuff that, there's certain things you can't put in a contract and they honored all of that. So that experience overall, I would say was good from their side. I was very stressed because I was like trying to protect my team. My team was of course stressed around things and I took on a lot of emotional burden I maybe shouldn't have, but I felt very protective of them. And as a result was like always triggered. Like, oh my gosh, my team's upset at XYZ thing that just happened. And somehow that's my fault because I sold the company. That's what I kept doing. So I eventually let that go, but it was, the transition time was hard and not because of the acquirer, if that makes sense. It's because I overthought a lot of things and I frankly was still burned out. Like it took me, I think it wasn't until after I left and then I took 6 months totally off that eventually undid my burnout. It probably got better. It got better once I sold because then I didn't have to do all the operations, right? I handed off all the stuff to the acquirer. But I definitely still felt that sense of stress, that existential dread for quite a while, even post-acquisition.
So it didn't just flip off when you cashed the check.
No.
There was a bit of a hangover.
Yeah, the check, exactly. That's a good way to describe it. The check helped though, I will admit, because then I could just breathe easy and say, no matter what happens here, it's like my life is set. Like that was a very, for me as someone who grew up where money was an issue at home, and I was always constantly in a scarcity mindset around money, having that amount in the bank for me was a huge relief. But day to day, still grinding on the job was not the best.
How did it impact when the check cleared? How did it impact your relationship with your wife? I'm going to ask her later. So
yeah,
we've had for folks who don't know, Rob's wife is Dr. 𝙎𝙬 Walling, who we interviewed probably 3 months ago about some of the psychological impact of entrepreneurship and in particular exiting. It's a great episode. One of our actually most popular. I think she actually beat you, Rob. I got to tell you that.
I bet she always does. She's always the bigger girl.
But anyways, it's a great episode. People should listen. But that's why I'm asking. Is she's obviously very informed as it relates to the stuff. But you're also in a relationship together. I'd just be curious to know how it impacts you.
It took a while to heal. Like again, I had damaged the relationship with how I was, right? I was closed off and was not, for a year. I was stressed about money. There was a point where there was a big tax bill in 2014 and I was stressed about that for 6 months where I was like, how am I going to pay this thing? And then 2015 was hard for other reasons. And then I started burning out. It just was this long sequence of this very extended like unhappiness. And when you're around someone and involved with someone who's that unhappy, like I was, it doesn't go away overnight. And while the money was a big thing for me to feel comfortable with, and certainly 𝙎𝙬 was like, oh, that's great. It didn't solve all that overnight, and it took me, we recorded a podcast episode within the month after the acquisition talking about how that was. And I could feel it in her that she was like rightfully angry, and rightfully still kind of like, is this going to get better or did drip ruin you for life? Because I was you become a different person, right? When you're in that mindset, that negative mindset. And then over the next year or two, so again, it was a hangover. It wasn't a slight switch. And the money meant a lot less to her than it did to me. Because to me, it meant a kind of safety, I think, and a cushion for life. And for her, I think it meant, well, Drip's gone. Now maybe he'll be sane again.
Have you always thought of yourself as sort of the provider for your family? There's sort of there's a stereotype type, right? And it's a male stereotype, and it's, it's a very uncomfortable, unpopular thing to say. But men, particularly young men, are still socialized to this day to say, "Hey, you got to be the provider for your family. You got to make sure you take care of everybody." Was that a message that you heard as a kid, and how did that impact you in this whole thing?
I heard it a little bit, but frankly, Sherry and I have always viewed each other as equals. We very much co-parented, and we both went to the same university, got 4-year degrees, and then I stopped at bachelor's and she got a PhD. So I was always like, "Hey, make as much money as you can. If you can provide for me, that's great." But what happened is I was an engineer, then I was a startup founder, and at different times, she was like, when I was an engineer making almost $200,000 a year as a consultant, and Sherry was an intern. She was doing her internship for her PhD, making 30 grand. So it wasn't that I felt like I had to provide, but the realities was I did have to during those years, right? That was 2008, 9. And then as she, I guess as Drip evolved, and I frankly had a lot of different projects going on, I was making substantially more money than her. And while I didn't feel like I had to, I guess in the back of my mind, I'm like, if either of us is going to sell something for enough money we never have to work again, it's probably going to be me, because I'm on that trajectory, and she was at the time, but she was a clinical psychologist working for a salary. And so I knew that would never come. Now, the interesting thing is, these days, she makes more than I do, and I'm totally fine with that. And so, that we've kind of had this switch where I'm not optimizing for income right now, to be honest, right? I'm playing more long-term games with Tiny Seed. Whereas she has this amazing business that is now, doing much better.
Awesome. Let's switch gears to talk a little bit about the period after you left Drip totally. So you sold, you did your 2-year earnout, you're totally out. What was that like for the first couple of weeks when you no longer had a 9-to-5 job to go to?
Some of my favorite weeks of my entire life. It was so much relief. Much like right when we sold, check hit the bank. I remember next couple of weeks, huge relief, but then the stress kind of built back up as it's like, well, I got to go to a job now and people are reporting to, I'm still working. Leaving it was April of 2018 was like huge weight lifted off my shoulder. And I could instantly feel that I was going to do something. I knew I was going to do something interesting in the future. I didn't know what, but I savored those moments. And I still tell entrepreneurs today, if you sell a company for any substantial amount, take a minimum of 3 months off. And if you don't have to work, try to take 6 months off, which is very hard. I mean, I think in a perfect world, it would be a year, honestly, but none of us do that. All right. I took 6 months off and then I started working.
You took 6 months?
Yeah.
What'd you do?
I did a lot of thinking about what I wanted out of the next act of my life. Because I feel like this was the third act. Like my first act was being a developer and turning into an entrepreneur and eventually, making enough money that I could work for myself, 100 grand, 150 grand a year. Second act was really ramping up Drip, selling that. And the third act is, well, what's next? What do I do for the next 10, 15, 20 years? So I did a lot.
Do you mind if I ask how old you were at the time?
Yeah. When I left.
When you left Drip. Yeah. The moment you're describing where you took 6 months off.
Yeah. Like 43, early 40s. Yeah. 42, 43.
Yeah.
And so plenty of time. I'm not going to retire. I mean, none of your listeners are going to retire either, right? I think a lot of us are going to work for because I don't view work. I view work as something that brings me, I've always gravitated towards what I enjoy, and what's creative. And so my podcast and my events and stuff, I'll do those until I can't do them anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time thinking though about what I wanted this next act to be. And, something we haven't talked about is in addition to software companies, I also had started what is like the most popular podcast around bootstrapping software companies, bootstrapping SaaS. It's called Startup for the Rest of Us. Started that in 2010. So I was already 8 years into that. And then started Microcomp, which is now an online community, but it was in-person events at the time. And I was a little burned out on everything. I was just burned out on life, right? But that made me think, should I just step away from startups altogether? Because that was part of my personal brand, right? I'm the guy that helps teach people how to start startups and build SaaS companies. And we actually got around this time, I think it was a little earlier than this, but we got a cash offer to sell it was a 7-figure offer to sell MicroConf. And I was really leaning towards doing it. Like,
MicroConf, for folks who don't know that name, is a conference for startup founders, in particular SaaS founders, to come together to learn from one another. Is
correct.
That right? You've got speakers, and so people have been to those kinds of events.
Yeah, there's events, and then we have an online community, like a Slack channel, and we have education and mastermind matching, the whole deal.
Okay, just to be clear, you were running these in parallel with Drip. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And MicroConf at the time was a side project, really. Like the startup for the rest of us, the podcast, and MicroConf were hobbies, and I did them nights and weekends. And then Drip was the day job.
No wonder you were burned out, man.
Well, that's the thing, in 2020 hindsight. Now MicroConf and Tiny Seed are my full-time job, and I think, how was I doing that with young kids? It's I'm sometimes frustrated with my own lack of personal insight, I think. But I took that 6 months to figure out, what do I want to do next, and really considered just selling everything, shutting the podcast down, and actually started a negotiation with the second largest website for tabletop games, like board games, because that's a hobby of mine. And I was thinking, maybe this is my next act, is to go to conferences and start a YouTube channel and become a gaming influencer. And I was seriously considering doing that.
Wow. So so on the table, you've got Startups for the Rest of Us as a podcast. You've got MicroConf, which is, those two were a bit of a hobby. You sold Drip. You've got 6 months, you're kind of contemplating the world. And the tabletop gaming, it is something you've always had a passion for. Mm-hmm. You were thinking about buying a company in that space. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just a website. Because I was going to build it from scratch, and then it's like, why do that? Now you don't start over once you have these resources,
And so one of the options, door number one, was, I'm going to sell it all. I'm going to sell MicroConf, and then I'm going to do the gaming thing. Mm-hmm. What were door number 2 and 3?
Door number 2 was to double down on MicroConf and the podcast, because it's something that I had basically done mostly for free, break even, little bit of profit over the course of the last almost decade. And so that was definitely still an option, right? To go deep in that. And I'd never worked full time or focused on it or built it out. And then door number 3 would have been find a third option, right? There was really no concrete option. I knew I'd started saying in like 2014, 15, like, I'm never going to start another SaaS app specifically. Like, I'll start another company, but I'm not going to start another startup, like a SaaS startup. And the reason was I felt like I'd kind of I'd learned what I came to learn. So for me, like, happiness comes from creating and learning. And by the time we hit 10 employees, I was like, I'm just kind of doing the same thing. The growth the engine's there. I'm going to go from 10 to 20 to 30 people. And then we got acquired, and we went to, again, tens of millions in revenue, 125 people. And by the time I got there, I was like, no, I really don't want to do any of this. Like, this is not in my wheelhouse, nor do I care about it. And although we were having a crazy impact, like amazing accomplishments, crazy impact on our customers and everybody in that space, it lost interest for me. And so it was option 3, door number 3, was never to start another SaaS app, just because I learned what I came to learn, and I wanted a new challenge.
But what about learning guitar or traveling to Europe or learning how to jujitsu or something? But like,
that's not work.
I'm not seeing the option that was put your feet up, head to the beach, because that's the image that we all have in our minds. Sure, it's on the front of the book. I mean, it's the idea is that, well, once you sell your business, you can put your feet up and relax.
So it's interesting that never once occurred to me as something I would do, and here's why. So in 2010, we had our second child, and I took almost 10 months off, almost completely off. I had a bunch of small businesses that generated, like I said, between 100 and 200 grand a year, plenty of money to live in California and Fresno. And I worked the 4-hour work week, almost literally. Like, it was like 10 hours a week, maybe. And it was fun. It kept me busy. And I got so I had a retirement of sorts, and I got really, really bored and really unhappy with that boredom because I wasn't learning and I wasn't creating. And so after I sold Drip and I knew that I was going to have infinite time to do what I wanted, I always knew that I would create and I would want to learn from whatever I was creating. So I had learned that lesson perhaps earlier than most because I'd had that glimpse into my personality, right, in 2010. And I think anyone who thinks that if they've been an ambitious entrepreneur for years and thinks that they're going to do nothing, unless maybe if I was like 70 years old and I was going to go hang out with grandkids or something, maybe. But any of us who are, in our age range, I just don't think that's the way it happens anymore, especially with tech. Like I know folks who've sold a company and they're like, I'm semi-retired. And then they go start a podcast. And then that podcast, because it's an interest of theirs, and then it gains interest. And then they're like, well, I might as well just start selling ebooks on this thing. And pretty soon they become knowledge marketers, people who have started a small side business that turns into a nice thing. I don't think of that as work, even though technically it is, but it's still something that is like, so we have a luxury of doing that today versus past generations, like my dad, for instance, did not.
What would you do differently about that 6 months? If you had a mulligan, you could do it totally over again. What would you do differently?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, I can't think of anything I would change. And I know that's a weird cop-out answer, but here's why. Going into it, I knew that I was leaving, and I was heading into it. I said, I will not have regrets about this time of my life. And so my brother gave me a year-long subscription to Masterclass, right? Masterclass.com.
Yeah, sure.
I did. What's funny is you mentioned playing guitar. I used to play guitar. I used to play in bands. So I started playing guitar again, just on my own. I watched a bunch of masterclasses. I upped my chess playing. I started playing chess a little bit. I started writing code again. I hadn't written code since 2014. I really enjoy that. I've always done it I learned when I was 8. It's like a hobby thing of mine. So I started coding again. I got into stock market investing. These are all hobby things that I actually embraced pretty heavily. I didn't do any work for that 6 months. And I just gave the universe space to figure out where I was going to go next. And the only thing maybe if I were to do anything is it would have been nice for it to be 9 months. It was 6 months. And then I took
6.
Yep. Not enough.
How did you know it was time to get back in the game?
It's a really good question, actually. So what happened was I was weighing this microconf startup ecosystem, personal brand thing, tabletop gaming, other options. And someone approached me. It was a friend of mine who I knew from the microconf community. His name's 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙀. And he said, he had listened to one of my microconf talks and said, you've been mentoring entrepreneurs for a decade and you've done some investments. I'd written some angel checks. He said, have you thought of starting a fund to invest in bootstrap startups? And other people had asked me this over the years. And it was always like, I don't have time. I don't have interest. I'm busy with other things. I don't know. Is there a need? All these questions. But this was coming right at this culmination where funding for kind of indie.vc is a kind of indie funding, they call it. And this stuff was becoming a lot more palatable to bootstrappers. Like funding is losing its stigma. And I saw a real need in the space of bootstrappers to have funding to take it off hard mode. And that was where I started thinking, okay, we could do this now. We kind of slow rolled it for a while, but it quickly became, I almost saw this ecosystem in my head of the podcast and microconf, and this funding wing of microconf suddenly became very appealing to me. And I thought, wow, that would be super creative because it's a new thing to work on. And I bet I would learn a ton. You hear these are my things, right? Creativity and learning. I started becoming really entranced with the idea of building something new that also helped entrepreneurs. And I realized that had really been my mission for 15 years, or I guess it was about 12 years at that point. But it's I love creating and learning, but I also like interacting with entrepreneurs. And it suddenly, as I realized that the board game space, John, the economics of that space are so bad.
Really?
Oh, it's terrible. I could have acquired that website for not very much money, but I mean, the revenue he was doing was just, it was just not good, and there was no profit. And suddenly I realized like, oh, there's a reason that we're in the tech space, or we're in certain spaces, like the economics are just really bad. So I started thinking, do I want to leave this, what is one of the best business models in the world, SaaS? And do I want to go into a space that is, I think would wind up being a grind, it would have been a short-term decision.
Yeah, for sure. So for folks who may have not have heard of MicroConf, this is where you and are invest in companies, and you've raised a fund.
Tiny seed.
Tiny seed. Yep. You've raised a fund of people who want to invest in startups. So it's not only your money, but other people's money that you're investing. And those checks are 25 grand, that kind of thing? Or what's the average?
The average check between 120 and about 220, 250.
Okay.
250,000. Yeah, the bigger checks. Accelerator size checks. We've raised 3 funds, $42 million total to invest in about 210 startups across, and it's around the world. We invest in Europe and Middle East, and there's a focus on the US, Americas, but we have a Europe fund as well.
So this, what you envision, the kind of, again, MicroConf, the startups for the rest of this podcast, feeding into Tiny Seed, these 3 things kind of coagulating or triangulating together, it's sort of come to fruition, that vision you had.
Yeah. And in a way that it sounds so obvious in retrospect when we say, well, obviously Startups for the Rest of Us is aimed at bootstrap founders, and MicroConf has always served bootstrap founders with in-person events, online events. And now Tiny Seed is going to invest in bootstrap. It's an ecosystem. This makes perfect sense now that it's here. It wasn't that clear to me in 2018. I didn't realize they would all be so complementary. And then I did. And the moment that I did, I realized, oh my gosh, like I think my long-term mission in life, when I finally made this decision, what I actually did was I went on a founder retreat. So I went away for 48 hours to a cabin. It was 3 days, but 2 nights and 3 days, and no kids, no wife. And I just thought about things, and I asked myself a lot of questions. Sherry, my wife, has actually written a book called The Zen Founder Guide to Founder Retreats. And it is filled with a list of questions to ask yourself and to ruminate on and to think about in quiet, almost meditation in essence. And so I didn't listen to podcasts as I normally do, didn't listen to books. And I just thought and asked, kind of thought through all these questions. What have I loved doing my whole life? What have I not? What do I want this next act to look like? What do I not want to do? And as I got towards the end of that 2 days, I realized what I've been doing for free for a hobby for 12, 14 years was trying to help, was doing my own entrepreneurial things and fulfilling my desires to be creative and learn. But it was also helping other entrepreneurs succeed. And that brings me a ton of joy. And so that's when I realized, oh, Tiny Seed is just the next step of that. Like I could still do MicroConf and I could keep the podcast. And Tiny Seed is just rounds out that ecosystem. And that's where that's when I started getting really excited about, oh, I could do this now for 10, 20 years versus every SaaS app I always launched. I was like, do I want to run this for 10 or 20 years? That doesn't sound that fun. But when I think of Tiny Seed, MicroConf, Startups for the Rest of Us, I'd already done 2 of those things for almost a decade. I could certainly see doing them for another decade. And Tiny Seed is, in that same ecosystem, as I've said.
I'm a fan of Startups for the Rest of Us. Everybody should listen. If they don't, they should. Probably 3 months ago, you were transparent with your audience saying that you were feeling burnt out and that you wanted to kind of take some time away and kind of refocus and so forth. It sounds like things had gone a little bit full circle from the drip days, where, the obsession of and the stress of it had gotten you kind of down. Now as you say, Tiny Seed's a big entity. MicroConf's a big business unto itself. The podcast continues to roll. Have you made the same mistake? In essence, you've got all the money in the bank, but now you're kind of stressed out again. Like, did everything come full circle, or am I not hearing you correctly?
It's such a good distinction, and I'm glad you asked the question that way. The short answer is no, it is not. I don't feel at all the same way that I did back in the drip days. It is very, very different. And in fact, when I went on the podcast and recorded that, I wasn't burned out yet. I could see it on the horizon. That's the difference this time, is I saw it months in advance. And I started saying, okay, what exactly is it that's burning me out? And how do I help that? And for me, it's the grind of content production. So the company's actually, I'll tell you what we did differently this time that I've never done is we raised funding. And I've always bootstrapped, and I was always bootstrapping. It's hard mode, man. It is hard mode. I could never hire operations people because I was always putting, as I've already said, I was always putting money and making money. Once we raised money, it was like, oh, like our third hire was a director of operations who just does everything we don't want to do. And that makes my job is exactly what I want to be doing. Like every day when I wake up, I'm like, well, I totally want to go record this podcast. And I absolutely want to record this YouTube video. Like I have crafted the perfect job, and I have the luxury of that because we've raised funding. So any business I ever start from now on, I'm going to start with some type of funding so that I can do that. As a result, and from the experience of being burned out prior, I definitely saw it coming, and I'm already through it. That was a couple months ago. I did a couple things. One, I took, went to Costa Rica for 2 weeks with my family. Also just took some time off right when I realized that I just took a week off, stayed at the house. Didn't work almost at all. And I realized the content production was grinding on me. So I recorded an entire month of content in advance in like 2 days. And that was hard, but then I took a month off from content. And then I did it again. So I in another 2 days and took a month off. So for me, again, it's a luxury of being able to do that. Not every job allows Drip. I couldn't have done that with Drip because it was a different job. But I basically headed it off at the pass before it got to me, which I think comes from experience and from making the big mistake the first time.
Mm-hmm. I wrote a blog post, years ago now, must have more than 10 years ago now, called Life in 10-Year Chunks. And it was after I'd sold my last company, and I was making the case that one of the amazing luxuries of selling a company or choosing a career in entrepreneurship, I should say, is that you don't have a career ladder to adhere to. Unlike becoming a lawyer or going to work at Microsoft, where you sort of have to stay in the game, you can do as you just have done, which is the 6-month sabbatical, and you kind of can control your time. If I'm doing my math right, it was 2018 that you had this sort of 6 months. So do you see another sabbatical in 2028 when you're like, I'll probably have gotten Tiny Seed to where I want it to be. The pod will be going, but I'll be ready for another year
off. Yeah. I will admit I haven't given it a lot of thought, but I think that your question is something I should consider. And if I'm being honest, so we're about 5 years in now, right? Because this is 2023, into really doubling down on Microconf the podcast and starting Tiny Seed. And if I'm honest, I bet that I will want to take a chunk of time. 3 months. 3 months feels reasonable. So 6 months is like, oh, I'm burned out, I need to recover. 3 months is like, for me, plenty of time to be away from work. I could see doing that in the next couple years before, next 2 to 3 years. If I plan it well. That would be the big kicker for me, is like, can I step away for that long and have everything run? And I bet I could do that today, actually. It's an interesting exercise. I think each of us should ask, but I bet I could, as long as we aren't doing, because we do applications twice a year for the accelerator. As long as it's not during that month, I bet I could take 3 months off, mostly from work.
I want to switch gears and talk about family life. You mentioned family in Costa Rica, and I'd be curious to know how you dealt with the wealth that you've created with your kids. I mean, the worst nightmare in the world, I think entrepreneurs have is this idea that they're creating entitled kids who won't have any grit and determination and the ability to kind of pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And yet they want to let their kids participate in some of the financial benefits of all the hard work and the sacrifice. And so trips to Costa Rica and others, they want to do those things for the kids. So how did you guys handle the money stuff with your kids?
We've had a lot of very direct conversations with them about, hey kids, this is a weird thing to say, but you need to understand that we are rich. You are a rich kid. You are in a wealthy family. We didn't grow up that way, but you are. Know that. Understand you have privilege. Here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to bail you out of everything with money. When you break the iPod, you're going to buy a new iPod. Just because I have the money doesn't mean you do. So the kids got allowance, and the kids get, holiday gifts and such, but we will spend money on, so if they want to play sports are expensive. Both of them play instruments. They play cello and violin, right? And so we do pay for lessons. We never bring that up as a big deal. However, if a kid complains and says, I don't want to go to a lesson, we're like, great, it's $54. You can pay that out of your allowance, right? So we treat our kids similar to how we were treated as kids, that money is important, and it is I want them to understand it's scarce without having a scarcity mindset. There's a balance between those two. But you're absolutely right that I didn't go on trips to Europe and Costa Rica like my kids do. And we frankly talk to them about that. We say most people don't do this, so don't take it for granted. We also, the last thing I'll say is like, I've bought multiple books. There's like Rich Dad. I'm not a huge fan of Kiyosaki, but Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Guide for Teens. I have walked through both of my kids.
That's cool.
And there's another one that's like money mindset, 5 money mindsets for kids or something. Like I've walked through that to try to help them understand that money is a tool, not much more, and I don't know. We'll see how they turn out. I think they're relatively grounded, but they've definitely had an upbringing that's a far cry from where we grew up.
Yeah. I think it's one of the most challenging things, and even as they grow into their 20s, and it never really ends until you work through it. So, what prompted you've just written a new book, and I can see how this perfectly fits into the entire ecosystem you're building. The SaaS playbook really provides kind of an action plan for SaaS founders on how to build and successfully scale a SaaS business. This is the second on the topic. Your first one was really how do you start it, and this one's really more on the kind of how do you scale it, how do you grow it beyond it's just a lifestyle business. What prompted you to want to write it?
What's funny is coming back to 2018. Prior to that, I was always doing a bunch of stuff. I was starting a software company, and I had this other little side project, and I had this microconf thing, and I had this podcast, and it was just disparate, and I was being pulled in all these directions. In 2018, I realized, as we've said, I had this realization for the rest of my life, till I changed my mind, I'm gonna be going in this one direction. Podcast, Tiny Seed, microconf, they are all the same, right? They're all helping entrepreneurs. And my first book I wrote in 2010, and about 2 years ago, a friend of mine said, when are you going to write another book? And I said, never, because they're just too painful. You've done this 3 times. I'm super impressed. But he said, our space needs a book from someone who really knows what they're talking about. And I was like, what do you mean? Because I don't necessarily read all the books about SaaS and startups anymore. And he pointed out 3 examples that obviously I won't mention here, but he's like, this book is terrible and here's why. And this advice is bad and here's why. And he's like, there's the people who are shipping, the amazing founders, the Jason Cohens, 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙁, Dharmesh Shahs, they're too busy to write books for our crew. And so it's people who kind of haven't done it. And so that was him building the case for me he said, we need a book in our space that people can point to. And I kind of took it as a weird, it was a little bit of a burden on me because, again, my mission is to help entrepreneurs to multiply the number of independent, self-sustaining SaaS companies in the world. And I gave it a lot of thought because it's like, I don't really want to write another book. I don't enjoy I love having written. I just don't enjoy the act of writing. But over the next couple of months, he and I talked multiple times. And pretty soon, you know how it goes then, John, like the table of contents just wrote itself for me. Like I sat down and wrote the whole table of contents in like less than an hour because everything's in my head. All the stuff I needed to, right? So then I started the arduous process of doing it. But that was really the inception. And I'm very thankful. It was Ruben Gomez with 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙁, who I think in the book for that. But I don't think I would have done it without his encouragement. And it also, I then started floating it by other people that I knew. And they were like, oh yeah, I would love to read a book that kind of encapsulates everything. Because there's no one place that talks about basically non-venture track SaaS. Like how do you build a SaaS company without raising venture capital? And that was what I kind of wanted to put a treatise, down on paper.
The book is called The SaaS Playbook.
Correct. SaaS
and
Playbook.
I would recommend everybody grab the copy. I've read it and got a lot out of it personally, and think it's a great resource for folks in this space. So
thank you,
Rob. I'm so grateful for you taking the time to share your post-drip story. I think you're, as I said in the outset, a real mentor and shining light for me. And I think I'm just so impressed with the life you built post drip, and there's so much to be proud of. So I'm grateful for you taking the time and sharing your story with our listeners.
Thanks so much, John. It's been a pleasure.